Okay, welcome to Module 3.2. This is the second last module, second last video in Module 3. And today we're going to be talking briefly about population culture and the geopolitical landscape in the Americas. And again, remember, these videos are to summarize the key points that I want you to focus on as you do the readings and the activities. They're not a replacement for the reading. Okay, so what we're going to be covering today in general is population and kind of a perspective on population in the Americas. Then we'll be talking briefly about the cultural landscape, some interesting points that I want to make about how the cultural landscape of the Americas allows us to draw some boundaries. And then I want to introduce some of the geopolitical landscape, especially the issue of immigration and free trade. All right, so if we look at population in the Americas, the first thing I want to talk about a little bit is this idea of population density. And remember, population density, simple arithmetic density, is the number of persons on average per square kilometer. And a couple of important points come out when we look at the Americas in terms of population density. First of all, in North America, very clear characteristics come out. First of all, that for the most part, you'll notice right here, is kind of an important break east to west. Now, if you remember from last video, this is also approximately the 100th meridian. And what happens in North America is that east to west, agriculture had largely driven the distribution of the population. What you also notice, though, of course, is this emerging concentration in the extreme west, primarily in California. Now let's take it a little further and let's look at the question of the north to south distribution. And one of the very important points that we should note is that Canada, as a part of North America, is an incredibly sparsely populated country. To put it in perspective, the United States has approximately 310 million people, 312 in 2010. Right now the estimate is somewhere over 315 million. Canada, in contrast, has just over 30 million, so just over 10% of the U.S. population. And most of that population can be found in the Northeast, and most notably, if I kind of were to draw about a 100-mile boundary, virtually all of Canada's population, almost 90% of it, can be found within 100 miles of the U.S. border. So when we consider Anglo-America, it's really concentrated in terms of its population in the east and in the, if you want to think about the whole continent, in the southeast. Now in contrast, as we begin to move into Latin America, the first thing that we note is that as we move down southward, we'll notice right about here is where the Latin American population begins to increase on the isthmus. That is, the Middle American states have a fairly high population density, even though it's an area of relatively low density agriculture. And then as we move into South America, you'll notice that the big and important concept is that most of the population, you notice this area here, and if we kind of take a look at it here, that Latin American population in South America is coastal. That for the most part, the population has not extended far into the interior. And when we look at Argentina, the vast majority of its population is in the north. When we look at Brazil, the vast population is in the east and along the coastal margins. And we can see this in the north along this margin coastward from the Andean region. So very different distributions of populations, North America to South America. The other point that we're not really talking a lot about the Caribbean, but you'll notice how high population densities are throughout the Caribbean here. This is Hispaniola, that's Dominican Republic and Haiti, Cuba here and Jamaica here, Puerto Rico right here. And if we were to zoom in on all these islands, you'd see extremely high population densities. Now let's look at how the populations are distributed in terms of the population pyramids. Now remember, if you looked at this carefully during your text, what you would note is that the shape of the pyramid generally indicates growth or decline. That is, if it's wider at the base, it's growing. If it's narrower at the base, this population is stable or slightly declining. And if you look at the United States and Canada, one of the things that you see is that the U.S. population because this is relatively straight, kind of barrel-shaped, we have a relatively stable population that's growing very, very slowly. And then you'll notice that this decline moving upward has to do with our life expectancy, which is relatively long. Now in Canada, what we also see is that in fact the Canadian population, because it's actually kind of an inverted pyramid, actually shows some signs of declining population at this point. That is that the widest area, the shoulder, exists in the late 40s, which is somewhat past reproductive age, and so the number of children being born is actually declining. And so Canada faces the prospect of a population that will shrink over time. Now contrast this with two examples of states in Latin America. And I pulled Bolivia, which currently has a population of approximately 10 million people. Again, a fairly small country. But when we look at the numbers, what we see is that it's a rapidly growing population. And again, we can tell that because of this extremely sharp pyramid. That is, the population, the number of children, that is this level, far exceeds the number of people in the reproductive cohorts that are right here. And so people are doing more than reproducing or replicating or duplicating themselves. In other words, having more children than the parents. And that causes the population to grow. You'll also notice that the peak of this pyramid is somewhat sharper and shallower than we would see in North America. Now, if you move to Argentina, one of the more economically developed of the Latin American states, what you'll notice is that you begin to see, at least at the bottom, although not as high up as you see in the United States, you're beginning to see the stabilization of population. And again, if you look at this, what you're seeing is this is primarily the reproductive cohort, and what you're seeing is that that is reproducing roughly the same number of people. So Argentina's population is dramatically slowing in its growth. So when we look at these populations, we can see that some of Latin America is still growing rapidly, most notably Bolivia, Guyana, Suriname, and Honduras, El Salvador. But some of the states, Costa Rica, Brazil to a degree, certainly Argentina, are becoming more stable in their population. Now, the other thing that we can talk about in terms of the populations of Latin America especially is outward migration. And when you do the quick write assignment in section 3 and you read a little bit about the issue of immigration and movements in the Americas, what you should see is what is present in this map from your text. And that is that Latin America is a region of extreme movements. This is an area where people move, and what we will see throughout our study of world regions is that there is what we call push and pull factors. Push factors are those factors that push people out of a region in terms of emigration. Pull factors are those factors that pull people into an area. So for example, the United States, which is a major destination for much of Latin America, has a pull factor of higher wages, greater job opportunities, greater stability, greater educational opportunities relative to their source area. Push factors are usually the inverse of those. So for example, if we were to look at Bolivia, one of the push factors out of Bolivia is to some degree a lack of political stability, certainly not as good a job opportunities, fairly high levels of unemployment, and so all those things push people out of the area. Now, push factors can also be geopolitical in terms of internal conflicts, strife, criminal activity. All of those things can also be push factors. What I also want to talk a little bit about is the idea of how we understand the distribution of both languages and cultures in the region. And so what we will see here is this is a map that shows to some degree the distribution of areas in Latin America. And what you'll see here, if you zoom in on this image, and this is again an image from your text, is differences culturally across the region. And what I want to focus on a little bit later is why this looks the way it does. Why do we see so much distribution and difference in cultural aspects? And the first one that I want to talk about is the idea of colonization. So colonization, remember from your text, is the idea of a dominant world power occupying politically and strategically and economically another territory. So throughout the 1500s and 1600s, 1700s, and really through World War II, globally, Europe dominated the world in terms of colonial holdings. And this is certainly true. The United States and Canada were colonies of France and Great Britain, depending on which part of the North American continent you looked at, as well as Spain. And when we look at Latin America, what we see is a very, very precise overlay, if you will, of the influence of European colonization. And we'll talk a little bit about North America in just a minute. But if we look at this, what we see here, this is the right here, is what is called the Treaty Line of Tordesillas. And this was a agreement brokered by the Vatican that allowed for the Portuguese crown to control up until this distance, and in fact it was defined as a meridian from Spain, and everything west of that line was considered Spanish. So the Portuguese got everything over here, the Spanish got everything over here. So again, Spain is everything this way, Portugal everything this way. And what we'll see later on is that some of the islands off of the west coast of Africa actually became Portuguese because of this. But what we also see is that much of Central America, much of Latin America and North America, and all of Western South America is dominated by Spanish culture. In contrast, Brazil predominantly is dominated by Portuguese culture, although we will see this also extending down the coastal region here. But this influence, this colonial influence, strongly changed how languages are presented, how architecture evolved in the area, as well as agricultural practices and land holdings. Now, one of the important things that many Americans don't realize is that South America went through an independence period much like North America did, especially in the United States. And very early on, by 1820 effectively, all of South America had become independent from European crowns. We can also see that through much of South America and all the way into Mexico with its liberation in the 1820s. So by 1830, essentially, Latin America had changed from a colonial landscape to an independent landscape. And what we'll see is this is very different than what was the case in Southeast Asia, South Asia, and Sub-Saharan Africa. Now, what's interesting is that the colonial landscape in South America was dominated by Spanish and Portuguese. In North America was dominated by the British and the French. And for a number of reasons, it resulted in very different trajectories in terms of the sovereign states. And so as you do your reading, think about how the states in Latin America differ in terms of their trajectories after colonization than did North America. Now, one of the things that's interesting about this, and if you look at this figure from your text, one of the things that you see, this is an immigration graph that shows where source areas for migrants to the United States came from throughout our history. And one of the things that you'll notice is that the different populations changed through time. And this is very important, and again, in terms of the shaping of North America. And to a large degree, we can look at this graph, and it's not terribly different, although it is a little bit different for Canada. What you'll notice is that historically, the eastern part of the United States, and to a large degree, the eastern part of Canada, with the exception of the Quebec region, was dominated in its settlement by Northern Europeans. That's the green area here, and that's virtually all of the migrants up until really we see a break right about 1885. Now, starting in 1885 or thereabouts, you'll notice that the immigrant story changes dramatically, and you'll notice this yellow or mustard area here, and that is the southern and eastern European migration. And so during this period, we see Italian, large extent of Italian migrants, Spanish migrants from Spain, Polish, Ukrainian, and to some degree Russian migrants into North America. And you'll notice that this is relatively short-lived. There's a downward spike, not surprisingly, around World War I. Then it jumps up again. But then what you'll notice is you begin to see the presence a little bit of Asian immigration. And then everything kind of falls off, not surprisingly again, during the interwar years and World War II. And then as we come out of World War II, the system changes dramatically. And what we see here is the emergence of, right here, this area, which is Latin America. The Latin American uptick is rather dramatic, as is the Asian uptick. Both of those begin to be significant migrant populations into the United States. And so over time, what we see are layers of immigration into the United States, and that has a significant impact on our cultural landscape. Now, what we can also then see, if you look at the map, and this is how I want you to think about methodologies in geography, this map shows the expansion or the extent of European settlement in North America. And if you look at this, our early settlements, again, kind of the colonial period, you'll notice is this east coastal margin, and then you can see in Canada also this margin right here along the St. Lawrence. So if you go back and look at the previous figure, what you'll notice is that these are areas that were dominated by the immigration of Northern and Western Europeans. And so the cultural components that were brought from Northern and Western Europe were dominated in this area. It's also true that if we take out much of this area, all the way out to here, this is the period, again, of that Northern and Western European immigration, and in fact quite a bit of German, and you'll find a strong German population in Pennsylvania during this period, into southern Michigan, throughout Illinois, into Iowa. Scandinavian and Western European populations are strongly influencing this area. Now, the other thing, though, that's happening very interestingly is that in this area here, we also had French occupancy, and due to a number of factors in, for example, Nova Scotia and along the St. Lawrence Valley here, many of the French populations actually were pushed out and resettled in the southern area here, what we call the Acadian population, that is now part of the populations of Louisiana and are, in a sense, speakers of French Creole. And so we can see those connections at the kind of the transition periods of immigration into the United States. Now, if we look farther out, one of the things that we see is that this area, kind of this wider, later settling that goes out this far into North America, this occurred as there was beginning to be the transition or the westward migration of populations. And what's interesting about this is that as the somewhat settled Western European populations that were present in the eastern part of the United States became somewhat more affluent, or had at least the opportunities to move, they moved westward and were replaced in urban centers, especially in the areas in here, with Italian populations and Southern European and far Eastern European populations. Most of the time, there's a chain migration, that is, that Europeans came into urban areas first and then migrated west. But as these populations in the latter part of the century came in, a subset also moved far to the west as well. And so what we will see sometimes in the west are important Ukrainian, as well as Italian, as well as Russian populations that in fact existed in the far west. So we can see a layering of ethnic groups as we move through the hierarchy or the history of settlement in North America. But what we can also see is that when we look at the Americas, we can see a much broader integration today. And what this map does, and please look at this one in your book, this is actually economic blocks or trading systems. And what I want to note on this is how the map separates out. So we have a cultural component, but we also have a geopolitical component in the Americas. And one of the easy ones to recognize, one that affects us every day, is this line right here, and you really can extend this all the way up to Canada. And this is the NAFTA, or North American Free Trade Zone. And so this is an articulation of Mexico, the United States, and Canada. But what we also have are Central American trading blocks, Central American Free Trade Bloc, and you can see that through here. We actually have something called CARICOM, the Caribbean Trading Bloc, through here. And then we have blocks that associate Eastern South America as well as Western. Mercosur, for example, in terms of its economic articulation. And this is really the question, the contemporary question, which is how are the Americas going to continue to articulate economically? Now, as you read through this section, please think about that in terms of trade agreements and geopolitical articulations, and then the conflicts that are potential in this area in terms of political strategies. For example, Venezuela's somewhat conflicted and contested relationship with the United States based on its political views, the association or the lack of association between Cuba and the United States, and the question of South America's articulation with the entirety of the Americas. So again, as you read through that, think about political, think about geopolitical, think about cultural landscapes in the Americas. All right, we'll see you next time in Module 4.